Hi, I'm Chris Wilson. Today I'm going to be chatting with Thomas Mahler, creator of No Rest for the Wicked. And initially I was planning to interview him about his background and game development history and how he came to make this game, but he suggested it would be a lot more interesting if we just had a chat about action RPGs. So that's what we're going to be doing. Hey Thomas, how are you doing?
Hey, Chris. I'm really excited to have this discussion. I think this is going to be awesome.
Yep, I have no idea what we're talking about. We have no particular agenda. So yeah, we met actually last month in San Francisco for the first time in real life after chatting a bit online beforehand. We were both at GDC, and there was a private action RPG roundtable event with some devs from each of the ARPG studios. It was really good to meet you, and honestly, I thought that event was very cool.
Yeah, I thought so too. Like I went there mostly kind of like to figure out where is everybody's mind at, right? Like we are all like everybody in that roundtable is approaching ARPGs, and that's what I find really interesting from a very unique angle, right? And so that was fascinating to kind of like really understand how is everybody here thinking about potentially the future of ARPGs, right? And where the genre came from and where it could head and so on. It was fascinating.
Yeah, I was very pleased to see that there was quite small amounts of very little overlap between the projects. Like, for example, No Rest for the Wicked is incredibly different than Path of Exile and is different than, some of the other games that were shown there.
That's actually something that was a conscious decision on our side, right? Like, so when we started working on No Rest for the Wicked, we very consciously kind of like had to decide, like, hey, are we gonna take the same path as like Diablo, right? Or are we gonna try something very new, right? And our decision, or my decision, clearly was, no, we're like, if we play the same game that everybody else plays, we're probably gonna lose, right? Because you guys have had a lot more experience already, right? Like, have been through the ringer for in that particular genre for a long time, and I just didn't feel comfortable competing against like Blizzard and Grinding Gear games and so on, right, on that level. So the original history of like No Rest for the Wicked was, it was mostly like, it was created because I was playing Diablo 2, obviously, when I was, a teen, right? And I fell in love with it, same as you, right? But while playing, and I'm sure the same thing happened to you, right? I already was thinking of all these things that could be so great in the genre. And then Diablo 3 came along. And frankly, I was always a little bit disappointed with Diablo 3 because it simplified many things that I thought were really important to keep in the game, right? And made it a lot more arcadey, basically, which is where I didn't think the genre should be heading or would be heading, And then, there were just many things, especially from the Eastern industry, right? And what I mean with Eastern is like the Japanese designers. If you look at Capcom and From Software and so on, right? A lot of the things that they did, I thought would absolutely make sense in a traditional ARPG, which doesn't really make it a traditional ARPG anymore, right? But it wasn't really done. And frankly, during the development of No Rest for the Wicked, I was always really afraid that, and the whole team was, that somebody would do what we're doing sooner than us, right? And come out with that kind of like formula already. Because to me, it always made so much sense. But that didn't happen, right? And so now we kind of like have this fairly unique space where we almost created a new subgenre within the ARPG, where it's like kind of like mixing together what Souls games do with like what Diablo and Path of Exile and so on did, right? And that's where we find ourselves in now.
Yeah, I do respect that because to some extent the thing about action RPGs that really got me into it, that really excites me, is the itemization and build stuff, right? Like, the fact that you're finding these items where there are so many different ways you can use each one, so many different character builds they can go on, and they interact in interesting ways, and the grind of gradually incrementally improving stuff, and then having to question, okay, I've got this rare with a set of properties that are really good for my character and it fits in perfectly with regard to resists and so on, but now there's this unique item, and if I were to put that on, I have to change everything else I'm using to make it work. And that whole system there is completely independent of the combat that the game has. And so if you were to swap out the traditional like point and click Diablo rooted combat system that, for example, the one that's gone through the lineage of modern Western ARPGs, if you swap it out to the kind of Eastern thing that you're talking about there, the itemization doesn't necessarily need to change as a result of that. And that's why I found your project fascinating. That, you know, I don't have a background in playing Souls-like games. That type of combat I'm probably not very good at myself, but I really like the idea of trying to mash that up with the traditional way that ARPGs are built from a meta progression point of view.
Yeah, I completely see where you're coming from, right? And that whole itemization thing is also what got me, right? Like, because there's nothing like that thrill of like finally finding that one item, right? That has like an incredibly low drop chance and so on. But at the same time, I always felt like the combat, especially in those ARPGs, because I was there at Blizzard in the 2008 or so timeframe, right, when Diablo 3 was being created. And I remember distinctly kind of like that, hey, they wanted to do PvP. And even at BlizzCon, you could try Diablo PvP, right? Diablo 3 PvP. And then it never shipped, right? Because internally what they had was like, hey, this was a fun mode if you played with a pre-made character, right? But it was completely fucking batshit insane if you just applied all the crazy itemization and all of that stuff to your character, right? And now you were just kind of like entering PvP and boom, one shot, right? So from when we broke it down, it's actually interesting because we did a similar thing on the Ori games. That was the series that I worked on before, where the development approach was that we basically analyzed and studied Metroidvanias, right? Meaning Super Metroid, Symphony of the Night, and so on. Because to me, when I grew up, like those were some of the best games I've ever played, right? Like, and they were incredibly highly regarded critically as well. And then the industry decided for some reason, we're not going to make these anymore, right? Especially not on the AAA front, right? Like if you wanted to play a Metroidvania, like they were only shipped on like the Game Boy Advance and then the Nintendo DS and so on, right? But nobody really was eager to try a Metroidvania on like a AAA platform, right? And I thought that was always incredibly dumb, right? Like especially given that, hey, these games were so critically acclaimed, right? Like even now you look at Super Metroid and Symphony of the Night, most people would, you know, rank them as like part of their classics. But then the development approach, like what we did, was to look at, well, how could we innovate within that genre, right? And so the obvious thing is, well, you look at the core gameplay pillars. And for those games, one of the core gameplay pillars is platforming. And the platforming I always thought was pretty weak, meaning that if you'd take Super Metroid and if you take Symphony of the Night and you would remove the combat stuff and just turn them into platformers, they would not make for very fun platformers because the character controller that they have of like that, just the sheer act of like jumping around and so on, is very simple, right? And so that to me was always strange. And so with Ori, we said, well, that's where we're going to innovate. That's where we can really fairly easily reach kind of like the next level, right? And so we did that and we accomplished that. And I found out that I'm really good at tweaking that kind of game feel thing, right? And like really being in charge of how many frames of animations does this jump need to be, right? Like what is the startup active recovery kind of like for a jump and that kind of thing. And when we then did No Rest for the Wicked with the first prototypes, we approached it from the same angle, right? Like we looked at obviously Diablo and Diablo 2, Path of Exile, and so on. And we looked at the combat specifically, right? And we were like, okay, well, Dark Souls was kind of like started to become a thing, really, right? Like Demon Souls and Dark Souls were already out. And we were like, okay, that is clearly, like in many regards, the better combat system. Because if you study the combat that you have in Diablo, it makes total sense how it ended up being where it is, right? Because you have had Dave Brevik basically trying to make a turn-based game where he tried to kind of like just copy what XCOM did, because that was a game he loved, right? Because that's how a lot of developers work. They kind of like try to imitate a game they love and then put their own twist on it. And then the direction came from above, right? I think that, hey, they like turn it into real time, right? Because turn-based is kind of getting old in the tooth and so on. And so instead of, hey, I click somewhere and then my character walks over and then I have to click on attack and it's a separate action, right? It just became real time, right? But it was a very abstracted kind of combat system. In many ways, I would even argue there's not necessarily a combat system there. And that's like that I always thought would be fascinating to discuss with you, right? Because like of the whole way of like how do you approach a combat system, because you're coming from that angle of like, hey, you also looked at Diablo 2 and you ended up with Path of Exile, and there's a lot of kind of like design hooplas that can happen, right, during like when you actually make a combat system and so on. And I would argue like the thing that happens because of the foundation that's been laid out with like Diablo and Path of Exile and so on is that you always fight power creep, because a lot of the traditional techniques that have been used in games like Street Fighter, you see it in Monster Hunter, you see it in Dark Souls and so on, right, do not exist there. So I would just love to have that discussion with you, right? Like, how did you back then decide on what should the combat be like in Path of Exile, and and Path of Exile 2 especially after that?
The combat model in Path of Exile 1 is rather similar to Diablo 2's combat model. It has a similar kind of grid granularity, a similar kind of action system. And this is because we wanted to, we loved Diablo 2. We loved the feel of that. We obviously wanted to try to improve this, going 3D and doing a lot more complicated things. But we also didn't want to... A criticism I have about Diablo 3 as a Diablo 2 player is it felt too different to me. And I didn't want to feel too different from Diablo 2, which is why Path of Exile kind of needed to be similar to Diablo 2 so that audience felt that they were moving from one home to another. And, I love the Path of Exile combat. And part of the reason here is because I loved Diablo 2, and I'm kind of stuck in my ways there. And Jonathan always wanted to make it better. Jonathan loves, good combat systems, and always... And I don't mean to speak for him, but I think he would agree. He always wanted the Path of Exile combat system to be better than it was. And throughout the years, many improvements were made. And, it's in a much better place now than it was at release. But Path of Exile 2 was an opportunity for the company to actually do combat a lot better. And you'll be able to see that the improvements that were made there, there's an awful lot of complicated animation blending and, grenades bouncing around and cool stuff happening in Path of Exile 2 combat. And this is pushed by Jonathan wanting better for the combat system as a key goal. In fact, the entire reason Path of Exile 2 exists is because we wanted to make new character rigs so that we could do more advanced animation stuff, and that project ballooned out into the entire sequel that it is today. And so the motivation there is trying to make combat as good as possible. And there's a topic that I have been thinking about a lot this year in particular, which is that... What's the best way of describing it? So, okay. Back in the day, the games that you were alluding to, the turn-based games, were turn-based because that was the state of the art they could do on old computers, right? Like if you're running on an Apple II or an Amstrad or something like that, you don't have the horsepower to have some complicated, Souls-like experience. And so they essentially had RPGs be turn-based where an awful lot of stats are used. It's essentially simulating Dungeons and Dragons where there's dice being rolled and so on. And that traces its lineage through the early Diablo games. Diablo 1 was going to be exactly that, but in an isometric point of view, like XCOM. And then they made it real-time. But real-time, where it still feels kind of turn-based, you're still moving a cell at a time and doing attacks on monsters, but it's in real-time. And in Diablo 2, that was made more granular, made more fluid. You can run rather than walk. There's all this stuff, but it's still the same kind of lineage, as you were saying. And in this fantasy, if you want to do better at the game, if you want your character to kill faster and so on, you have to invest in the character's stats. If you want them to hit more accurately, you click the dexterity button, because it's your hero that's capable of fighting. They're the warrior, they're the spellcaster, they're the one who has the ability. You're just some dude playing a game in your underwear. And the character is the one, the fantasy is it's them fighting. And I feel that a lot of modern combat systems in games, like No Rest for the Wicked example, put a lot of this in the player's hands. They say, how do you think you'd do with all the timing? And they give you the ability to dodge out of the way and time attacks properly and have really granular positioning. And this is very exciting for players who want to demonstrate their skill at actually playing the game. And I feel that we have two camps here. One of them is like player power fantasy. You as a player get to demonstrate how good you are at playing. And the other one is character power fantasy. You build a character who does the playing, and the best you do is kind of click the dexterity button to get better at it. And sure, in that camp, there's still positioning. Like in Diablo 2, you still want to put yourself in a doorway, you still want to kite the monsters. It still matters. There's still action elements. But as far as the spectrum goes, it's way on the other side to what studios like yours are doing with incredibly realistic, Souls-esque combat. And Our mutual friend Daniel Stanzens commented earlier this year at the roundtable, in fact. He described it as dexterity players versus intelligence players, where a dexterity player wants to test their hand-eye coordination and how good they are with the controls, and an intelligence player is keen to come up with some clever character build that is, the best min-maxing of stats that does damage. And I find that a kind of a cool way of looking at it. I'm personally in the camp of wanting my character to do the fighting for me, partly because I care more about itemization and builds than I do about timing stuff perfectly. I don't love quick time events in games. I get the impression that you do very much like that type of combat, and that explains your design decisions.
Oh, I hate quick time events. I want the player to really feel like that character, right? And so nothing should be preset or something, right? It should all be, hey, we just give you a toolbox similar to a fighting game, basically. Like a lot of times, I'm actually openly calling the rest of the Wicked a fighting game because the way we author combat is basically exactly the same as you would in a Street Fighter or something, right? So for example, when you guys did animations for Path of Exile, right? I doubt that, and the same thing is true for Diablo, right? I doubt that anybody really strongly felt like, hey, we have to do what fighting games do or something, right? Or like, hey, for every one of those animations, we have to be very specific about startup, active, and recovery frames and so on, right? And then, hey, we think about frame advantage and we think about PvP and all of those things. And my thing was, well, even early on in development, I wanted to test our combat system by always also testing the PvP at the same time, right? Meaning that I think there's something like it makes total sense, like where David Brevik ended up, right? And then kind of like that Diablo formula became the formula for almost all our ARPGs out there for whatever, like 2 decades or something, right? And I think that is good. I think, like, obviously, like, if you look at Diablo 2, if you look at Path of Exile 1, I would argue that you probably outdid Diablo 2 ultimately, right? Which is interesting anyway, because I remember playing the Path of Exile 2 when Path of Exile 1 when it first launched. And it was very distinct, like, as a, hey, this is made obviously by someone who loves Diablo 2, right? And it's almost a love letter to Diablo 2. And then over the years, you guys actually improved so much, right? That it was fascinating that even when, Diablo 3 came, like Diablo 3 was there, Path of Exile was kind of like doing better at what an ARPG should do, right? And then Diablo 4 came along, and even then, like people were like, Path of Exile 1 is the better game, right? But if you look at it historically, right, we approached it from the angle of it makes total sense where Dave Brevik ended up with and what ARPGs were, because also there were, multiplayer, and then, hey, you played on a dial-up modem, right, and on your little Pentium processor. You couldn't have done, we have 3D characters, and every weapon has its own unique hitbox, and we actually moved that hitbox in the network model. So the network actually understands, or the network layer actually understands, my sword just went over your head, right, and didn't hit you because you dodged away in that very frame. It would just have not been possible, right? So when we looked at it, we were like, well, Monster Hunter is doing this now and has been doing that for a while and has been doing it even on the PlayStation Portable, right? So performance-wise, we should be able to handle that. And then the Souls games did the same thing. And I always I think as developer, you always need to kind of like play to your strengths, right? And my strength is definitely not systems design. I have people in the studio that handle a lot of that for me, right? Like I would never call myself a spreadsheet designer, right? And with a lot of the ARPGs of, traditional ARPGs, I think that is literally what the games are, right? Like in a lot of ways, it's very much stat-based, and you're following that dream goal of like, I want my character to have these stats and to basically be this database, right? And not necessarily, hey, my character has these moves, and and I feel like I'm playing that character and so on. And so if I look at, or the decision that we made was simply that same thing that we did on Ori, right? Like we looked at, well, could we help innovate within that genre, right? And what I haven't seen anyone done is that, well, on one end, you had the Souls-likes, which really didn't have that ARPG layer, right? And then you had the Diablo games, which all didn't really have that kind of combat, right? So in many ways, No Rest for the Wicked is an experiment of like, let's try to merge these together. Let's see if that actually meshes, right? And I think we achieved that. We're still kind of like, dabbling with that a lot because it's kind of like a new way of playing, which is why I'm saying, hey, it's almost like a new subgenre or something, right? But the thing was clearly like, hey, if we look at what is the future of ARPGs, to me it was just a clear, okay, one of the core gameplay pillars is combat, and I never thought that the combat was incredibly strong in those games. Like in terms of the depth of it, right? Because it isn't like it wasn't based on that, right? Like similar to how in Ori 1, combat wasn't the main part of it, and you could clearly feel that, right? And then with Ori 2, with Ori and the Will of the Wisps, we made combat a much more interactive and approach, and gave it a lot more depth, right? And we learned a lot there. And then it became this clear thing of like, oh my God, everything that we learned here, we could totally apply to an ARPG, right? And then when we made the first tests, it just became such an obvious, like David Brabik always talks about that moment, right? When Alan Adham asked him or forced him to turn Diablo into a real-time game. And that weekend where he tried it, right? After being so desperate about, no, why are they making me do this and all of that, right? Where he had this whole moment of like, ta-da, right? Like it became clear, like this was the birth of ARPGs, right? And when we tried the same thing with, hey, we're trying a Dark Souls model here, but it's top down. And when we made that work and tried the first PvP sessions and so on, it just became such a clear, it was the same thing, right? It just became such a clear, oh my God, that's what I would have wanted Diablo 3 to do basically, right? Like that you wouldn't have a point and click foundation anymore, but that you would actually, like, similar to a Street Fighter or Soul Calibur or any of these like Samurai Spirits or something, right? That you would actually, like, if you play against enemies, that spacing matters, that positioning matters, that timing matters, that you have all these elements taken over from fighting games, right? That, hey, you have footsies, you have whiff punishment, you have all of those things, right? And like you really author the animations that way. That was really the moment where we were like, yeah, okay, this is where we can innovate, right? This is where we can really change course. And it was super scary because we were like, throughout the whole development, we didn't know if that would be accepted by ARPG players, right? And at the start, it was actually like, we actually had quite a lot of players that came from the Diablo angle and the Path of Exile thing, right? Where they literally had this thing of like, well, this is like, I know how ARPGs play, right? And I just want to, like click that button and have that thing happen. And like, why is this so difficult? And all of that, right? But I think over time that actually changed. And a lot of the Souls players jumped onto it, right? And got it. And so that was fascinating to me, right? Like there's always this moment where I think genres probably become a little bit stale because a lot of developers already jump into it and like approach it there. And then at some point I think you have to kind of like reevaluate, right? And really start looking again at the core gameplay pillars and, hey, based on the tech that we have, right? And all of that stuff, can we give it more depth? Can we go crazier, right? That kind of thing. And I mean, similar to what you guys did with Path of Exile 2, where the goal was, hey, can we refine combat? But what I would be interested in is when you guys approached Path of Exile 2, right? Was there a conscious, like, did you guys consciously look at what Monster Hunter, Souls games, and so on did? Or was that more of a, oh, we already know how it works, so let's just play around and try it?
So Jonathan was working on the combat side of Path of Exile 2. My role on that project was mostly production, and he had played a lot of Elden Ring beforehand. I mean, it's better for him to discuss this, of course, and I'm sure he either has done or will do. But he certainly was quite impressed by the combat in those games and very much wanted to model aspects of that into Path of Exile 2, within reason, of course. He still wanted to keep the Path of Exile DNA in there, but there are lots of complicated internal things like poise and so on that have come across, as far as I understand. I have a question for you about this, because there's a thing in action RPGs where if someone wins the build game, like they win the itemization game and just get a character that's insanely powerful, it can invalidate a lot of the subtlety of combat, right? Like if you can click your
Yes.
click your button and kill everything on screen, then a lot of the features we've just discussed are less relevant. Have you guys had this happen in No Rest for the Wicked, and how are you dealing with that?
We just had it happen. So there was an interesting thing that just happened to us, right? Like we had polished the game a lot after the Breach update came out, because there were a lot of kind of like was a lot of feedback where we just fumbled the balance a bit, right, on the Breach update, where it was just, hey, the enemies were tuned too difficult and so on. Some areas that you entered at like too low a level and so on. And so then we shipped the Breach Refined to kind of like make up for that, which was just another patch basically. And then we had some time and like tune things more and polish things more and so on. And then No Rest for the Wicked Together came out, and it was probably a little bit overtuned in terms of the player power, right? Meaning that you had lots of builds there that were pretty OP, right? Where you could literally just get 100% damage resistance and so on. And the funny thing was that we just then like shipped a bunch of hot fixes after that, and then we shipped a bigger patch where we fixed those stats, right? So you couldn't get 100% damage resistance, because that's ludicrous, right? Like you shouldn't be able to get 100% DR in an ARPG. No matter, like, doesn't matter if you're a really good player or if you found that super rare item or something, right? And there was like players, I think, at large understood why we made those changes, right? But there were still some people that were like, oh, you took the toys away from me, right? So I wanted to ask you, I'm sure this happened to you plenty of times, right? Where you guys overtuned things, gave the players accidentally, right? Like, oh my God, players can equip this ring, and then some stat changes, and we didn't actually foresee that. How do you deal with that? Because there is always this, here's the integrity of the game, right? Like, here's how the game should work. And then players find exploits, right? And then you fix the exploits, and the logical thing should be that players go, oh, absolutely, that makes sense. You know, like now the game is better balanced and it works, right? But in many ways, like if you do that, you're also taking away the fun thing that players had before, right? Where they were able to play God mode, right? And then they react negatively. But what was your approach there? Because I'm sure you dealt with power creep and that kind of stuff tons of times on Perfect.
Yep, that was my life for quite a while. A topic that's important here is understanding the investment the players have made into their character. If you had a hypothetical action RPG with really easy respecking and a character editor where you can just type in whatever, if Path of Building were the game, for example, where you just synthesize whatever you want, then upon the character being changed, there's relatively little work for them to go and, make a new build. But the reality is, when you're playing a Path of Exile character, it represents dozens or hundreds of hours put into leveling up, getting the right skills, the investment in getting the items. Like if the items for the build are very expensive, you've got to grind for a long time. And having that essentially taken away or made useless by a balance change is a very disheartening thing to happen as a player. And the tricky thing is these games are structured so that it's a puzzle to find the best build, and they feel that they've won the puzzle by playing that build. They've done the right thing, the thing you're meant to do in the game of play the broken character. And then they get told, oh, sorry, you weren't supposed to pick that character. We've decided that was too good. Now all of your time and effort is wasted, and a guy that picked the second best character is now the best. And so obviously fixing exploits or bugs that are clearly unintended is important, but we found that just regular balance changes, even quite large ones, are honestly best saved for between characters, as it were. When you start a new season and people have finished their previous character, they obviously will be disappointed if the old build doesn't work the same way because they had a fantasy about playing it. But being able to factor that in for their new character, make a new set of decisions, and not have wasted any time is quite important to them. So often, if you release something without enough testing, you just kind of have to live with it for a few months until the next release.
Chris, let me ask you something real quick. You just mentioned seasons, right? And that was something that, well, Diablo 2 started, right, with like, hey, it made sense because you had a ladder reset, right, and the whole economy reset again and so on, right? And then you guys also picked that model for Path of Exile. And I watched your GDC talk back then, which, by the way, I loved, right? Like, I think every developer,
thank you,
anybody who makes the RPGs watched that and was like, Jesus Christ, that's so smart. why did you pick the seasons model? Rather, I think the better question is, given that you've had to do this for 10 years or even more than 10 years, right? And you had to come up with new stuff and so on every 3-4 months or something, right? Would you still do it? Like if you do it now, right? Like, because there's this whole thing of like, hey, are we crafting a Diablo 2, which is where we just trying to create the perfect thing, right? Like almost like a toy that people could play as is for like 10 years and still find new things and go crazy? Or are we actually constantly shipping updates and create new things and so on? And we're forcing ourselves to do that every 3-4 months and so on. I would love to hear you talk about that and where your mindset is now.
Well, there are two separate topics here I want to discuss. The first one is, are seasons good for live service games? And the second one is, how do I feel about live service games? And so in terms of seasons being good, seasons are the secret sauce that made Path of Exile successful as far as I'm concerned. I think if we had to run standard forever, that it would not have had the player numbers that it eventually did. There's something magical about a new league or a new season in an action RPG. It's this fantasy that if people take a few days off work and they all pile in there and play better than everyone else, and everyone thinks they can play better than everyone else, that they will find the best items, they'll get to the highest levels, they'll control the economy, and because of the randomness in the games and the fact that it's a bit of a lottery with regard to what you get, this actually does come true for people. They have good seasons. They have a season where they get rich and find the best stuff, and it's just dopamine everywhere. And this is the fantasy they're looking for. If it doesn't happen to them, they see it happen to other people, and that reinforces that it could happen to them. If only they, took an extra day off work and played that bit harder. And these new seasons are just a magical time for the game. You see a massive spike of player numbers, right? Like there are games in the past, like you look at the player numbers for the launch of Wolcen and Last Epoch and so on, you get 250,000 players because it's a new action RPG that people can play seasonally. And I posit that if someone were to make a competent live service action RPG and release it, they're going to get these numbers because the players are desperate for seasons. Now, doing seasons repeatedly for excuse me, doing seasons repeatedly for a long period of time is tricky. Like, if the game doesn't have legs, you'll see numbers declining and that kind of stuff. And that was part of the difficulty with Path of Exile, was how do you make season numbers go up? And, I don't have accurate stats on current PoE seasons because many of the players aren't playing on Steam, so they're not publicly available. But my understanding is that Path of Exile 1 is hitting record player numbers after I left GGG, right? Like it's still a growing game despite the fact that we started it 20 years ago this year. Yes. And so seasons are great. If a law was passed where the game had to not have seasons anymore, that would be a very bad thing, right? Just, especially the way the players have been trained. So in general, I think if you're running a live service game, there's a lot of value in doing seasons well. I personally, especially as I get older as a gamer, have growing problems playing and enjoying live service games. So I'm defining live service here as I'm defining live service as games that are constantly evolving, right? Like they've got new updates coming out all the time. Because when you have people playing, 10 hours a day, 16 hours a day, the streamer group or people that just really love the game, they need new content to keep it fresh. And I'm not trying to argue that a game with no new content is going to entertain one of those people for tens of thousands of hours. Like eventually you run out of stuff to do. But there's something nice about every time I returned to a game like Diablo 2, over the last few decades, is pretty similar to where I left it previously. I mean, sure, recently there's been a push to new content, and that's obviously going to mean that it changes. But there was a case where if a new ladder's coming up for D2, I know how to build my sorceress. It's probably going to work. This is a minor adjustment. Now Mosaic exists where it didn't before or whatever. But the amount of live service going on was very low. And like I find this problem with Magic the Gathering, where when I go to play it, I don't recognize any cards, right? Like not only the fact that, there's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles on them, but also the fact that there's so many new abilities being printed. There's new sets coming out so frequently that I don't know what's going on. And I struggle when I return to playing my favorite live service games to have to relearn stuff. And with limited amounts of, free time for gaming, it means that in a given 3-month season, I'm only going to see a small portion of the content because I'm not playing 16 hours a day. And then the next season comes out and changes everything. And I kind of want to slow a pace with this stuff in terms of my personal enjoyment of things. And so my feelings are that, like I respect something like Baldur's Gate 3, where they made a game and they worked on it really hard, and their goal was to make it as good as possible. With something like Baldur's Gate 3, it would be entirely judged on the game that's on Steam on the day of release. If that game is bug-free, well-balanced, and perfect, it will review well, it will go viral, everyone in the world will play it, and they will be praised for making a perfect game. And that entire approach is quite different to live service games, where the goal is we're releasing this and 3 months from now we're releasing a different thing, and we have to be constantly thinking about what's next, and there's going to have to be patches, so we're going to fix a bunch of stuff, and there's time pressure, and it's an entirely different development strategy basically. And I've been coming, and again, is because I'm getting older, and releasing a new version of a game every 91 days is a very, very tiring thing to do. That I've been thinking a lot more about the idea of a more slow-paced work on a game until it's perfect kind of approach, rather than the fast-paced development model.
Do you mind if I ask you a quick follow-up question?
Yeah, of course.
So I've been outspoken on, like, with No Rest for the Wicked, we launched it into early access, right? And we always knew, well, this is the amount of content that we will have for early access. We're not going to do the latter part. We're basically copying in many ways what Larian did with Baldur's Gate 3, right? Where we're saying, hey, the early access is really there to fine-tune the systems, to polish everything, so that at 1.0, when we come out, the game is really tuned, right? And so that critics and players and so on will all go, what? Where did that come from, right? Well, it came from us having the time to polish it, to iterate, to go crazy with it. And one of the things that I've been harping on about recently is that with No Rest for the Wicked, in many ways, we are almost trying to create a platform, meaning that I'm not even satisfied by just, hey, it's another new ARPG, right? And it's smashing souls and Diablo together in a new way. But I love ARPGs, and I even saw this during the very early prototypes of No Rest for the Wicked. Like, when I had the character controller up and running, right, I did a little tower defense thing, because I think I was playing Kingdom Rush at the time, right, and was looking into that and got quite addicted to it. And I was like, Jesus Christ, that is really fun. Like, creating a tower defense game where you basically have an ARPG, like where waves of enemies come in, but now you're not just tapping the towers and upgrade them, right? But you're actually the player character. You are that hero that has to go around and, like, deal with stuff, right? And then the towers are just support. That was incredibly fun. And in many ways, I'm still trying to follow that principle of, like, how do we create new elements in the game? So, for example, in the Rest of the Wicked, we have the Crucible, which is basically our roguelike mode, right? Where we throw stuff at you like, hey, you're going through these rooms, and there's, like, you never know which enemies spawn, and like, as you defeat enemies, you get a resource, then you buy boons, and you kind of, like, get a little bit more of that Diablo-esque feeling of just constantly getting power, and it's just the whole ARPG thing, but delivered in, like, a really short time span, right? I also thought, in that sense, by the way, what Vampire Survivors did was really smart. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. But my whole thesis was, once you have a good game where the core pillars work, it is actually really addictive and super fun to add new mechanics, right? And I thought you are the perfect person to talk about this with, because you did this for 10 years, right? Where every season was like, oh my God, we're changing the way Path of Exile works. We're introducing some new mechanic. We're introducing some crazy new thing that will keep players super engaged again, right? So what and funnily enough, like, one of the things that I did internally to explain to people that, like, to our developers, right, that, hey, this works, like, we can totally do this, and it wouldn't even be that hard to do, was that, well, I took Quake 1, which the source code is out there, right? So I basically just hacked Quake 1 and put a roguelike mode in, right? And I was, like, surprised how quickly you could change Quake and the traditional loop of Quake, right, that everybody knows, like, how you could change it, where it's like, hey, you start as a grunt with, like, just 50 health and, like, only, hey, my max capacity on shells is 10, so now I really have to think about my resources, and every ammo pack suddenly becomes important, right? And it totally worked, and that was really surprising. So, or not surprising, but it confirmed my idea that, hey, we can totally do this. We can put farming into Wicked, and there's no reason, no logical reason, other than us potentially fucking up, right? That that it couldn't be as good as a Stardew Valley, right? Or if we add a survivor style mode, that it couldn't be as good as as what Vampire Survivors did, and so on. And that I actually find incredibly fun, right? Because you're just sitting there trying new things, and then instead of like already as a developer, instead of me sitting down and like if I'm really enthused about making a survivor style game, right, I wouldn't start from scratch. I would just use all the stuff that we already have. Like we have all these enemy models, enemy animations, we have hundreds of weapons, right? Why not just create it within Wicked, right? And that is the approach that I'm taking right now, and how I think we can keep Wicked endlessly entertaining, right? And kind of like create that forever game. And I would just love to hear your opinion on this, because you went through 10 years of like having to think rapidly of like, okay, here's the Path of Exile experience. What can I introduce now, right? That makes it really different, right? And that that makes players think about the game in a really different way, right? So 2 questions basically, right? Like, how do you feel about that approach in general? And the other thing is, which season did you think, like where you introduced some mechanic, did you think was the best? Like that was the most addictive, coolest thing that we ever did?
So it works remarkably well to take a game and to permute it like that. And we were often asked, how do you have all these ideas when you're going to run out of ideas? And sometimes, when it takes a while to think of one, we wonder, like, is that it? Have we done all of the ideas now? But I kept going back to Magic the Gathering, where at that stage they were, X years ahead of us, and they've done hundreds of expansions now and are not running out of ideas for well, I guess they did when they started using other people's IP. Well, prior to that point, they hadn't run out of ideas for cool expansions. And that was our model, where we knew there was more stuff out there. And for a while we'd load up Netflix and we'd go through movies and we'd look at a movie's poster and say, can we do a league of this? And that's where Heist and Harvest came from, right? One of them had plants, one of them had a heist, and we're like, yep, there's 2 leagues. And it comes up with ideas, and it's really cool. In terms of ones that I felt were impactful, I actually thought that Our Breach, that is a long time ago, where you have, your expanding circle of hard monster fight, kind of canonically captured what we wanted from a true Path of Exile league, where it's about more intense combat for a brief period of time with rewards associated with performance. And a lot of leagues have had monster circles after that with different mechanics in them. Ritual, a different type of monster circle with a different reward structure. And of course, some of them are really out there, like the idea of going and growing a garden or capturing beasts and having Pokemon essentially or whatever. Those, were cool, but I think that the ones that affect your actual core combat experience and make you have a lot of adrenaline when you're engaging with it and have some kind of progression system in the background are the ones that capture, Path of Exile leagues best for me, in my opinion.
Interesting. Do you like how one of the interesting things that happened during the ARPG Roundtable, right, is that I consciously threw a bunch of wild ideas out there, right? And I wanted to see how does everybody react to that, because I think, like, again, I love the genre because of how versatile it is, right? Because you can do almost anything, right? Like right now we're pulling Stardew Valley-esque mechanics into Wicked, right? And you can do a lot of the stuff that Zelda did. You could do puzzle-esque events, right? You could do the Vampire Survivors thing. You can come up with horde modes. You can do so many crazy things, right? Like, how do you think about ARPGs in general? Like, so, because right now, like the thing that bothers me a little bit, right, is that if I play Diablo 4, for example, right, the answer to almost everything is go kill monsters, right? And so the thing that I'm interested in is, can we make that more diverse? Can we add more interesting things where the answer is not always, well, go kill, right? And the only verb is really kill, right? But just also do something else, farm, or, grow, or whatever you can come up with, right? Because I think that is incredibly interesting. That's where you really push the limits of the genre and merge things together. And I just recently, like the Jeff Kaplan interview with Lex Friedman, I thought was interesting, because I felt like, hey, oh my God, like a lot of the stuff that we are trying right now, they tried with Titan, but I think Titan was planned as like too many things at once, right? Like before, a core design was there that you then expand upon, right? But you keep it based on, like, you keep that core life always. Like there is a beating heart that works, and then you extend it into extra modules, right? That connect with the beating heart. I thought that was really interesting, right? And I thought, when I listened to that, I was like, I think the reason why it probably failed is because it became too overwhelming. It's already incredibly difficult to create an ARPG by itself because they're so unbelievably complex, right? But I think the thing that excites me for the future is just how much stuff can we pull in, right? So, and I'll give you one example. Like last year, I was working on a short prototype, again, like within Wicked, where I basically just looked at survival games, and especially like things like Don't Starve Together and so on, right? Where I literally just hacked into the Wicked code base and was like, okay, I'm going to make this work locally, so I'm not screwing up the repository that we have and so on. And I made a survival version of Wicked, and it totally worked. And within like 2 or 3 weeks, I had something where I was like, I think this is crazy, but I think this is like the most fun I ever had in a survival game. Simply because when you craft a survival game right now, and you would make the pitch to any publisher out there or something, right? Like, hey, I want to craft a survival game that has Dark Souls as combat, that has 400 weapons, that has 100 plus enemies, all with unique animations and everything. They would all show you the door, right? Because they would understandably get that what this would be prohibitively expensive, right? But the funny or interesting thing is that if you do it within a game that already exists, that already has that base, then I think suddenly it becomes feasible, right? Then I think suddenly, and obviously because I proved that, right? Like I was like, hey, here's a survival game that has all these things that you could never do from scratch because it would cost you $50-60 million and it would just not work, right? But I would love to hear your thoughts on that, right? Like I'm just still amazed by like how much ARPGs invite you to do, right? And how you see the future of ARPGs. Like how much do you think we can mix and match there and add other influences and so on?
I think that the fact that ARPGs is versatile is really good and is fertile ground for us to explore that kind of stuff. And, the 40 plus PoE leagues that tried to change gameplay in weird and exotic ways still being fun, despite the fact that gameplay was changed, is a testament to that, as with your survival experiment you did there. I think an important aspect here, though, is identify what part of the ARPG is the key thing that's causing people to play. Whether that is, for example, your combat, or whether it is the feeling of finding an item drop. Like, for example, if you were to ask me, I would have said that in the Diablo 3 Path of Exile lineage, the part that I feel is the core loop is that you leave town and then there are pressures to return to town to do with inventory and to do with, like, other resources, repairing potions, whatever it is, there's pressures to return to town. And on your excursion, you want to maximize the value you get. You're looking for item drops, you're optimizing how much you take back in your inventory. And if that loop remains intact in the variation of the game, it's probably still a lot of fun. For example, if farming involves leaving, getting some stuff, there's random drops that are exciting, and you have a chance of getting cool stuff, and then you come back with your haul of what you farmed, totally compatible with an ARPG, a lot of fun, I don't see a problem. If farming is deterministic, where you just get a consistent thing like a treadmill, like Farmville, for example, it probably is different enough from the core RPG stuff to seem boring in comparison, or maybe not feel like it works. So I think the important part is retaining the essence, because if we start stripping things out of ARPGs, like, I feel if you took an ARPG and made it actually turn-based, it would still have its addictive item systems. It wouldn't be action anymore, but it would still potentially be a fun game. I don't think either of us want to play a purely turn-based one. I think if you took away the top-down camera and went first person, it would still work. And as you strip features away, the game is still reminiscent of the feeling it's trying to create. But I feel as soon as you take away the way that rewards are generated in these games, the pacing, timing, and magnitudes, the Skinner box stuff of the rewards, as soon as that's gone, the game loses the element that we're celebrating here with the genre. And so I feel that any modifications you make still have to have the the pacing and magnitudes being sufficiently randomized to create those feelings as you play it.
I always call that connect the dots when I talk to people internally, meaning that if you introduce a feature and it stands completely by itself, then it's almost parasitic, right? Where it's just, this doesn't work, because when I introduce something like farming, for example, then it has to still feed into the core gameplay loop, right? Meaning that, well, what do I get from farming, right? And then, well, you can sell this stuff and you can get gold, right? Or, well, the more obvious thing is, well, you get all those ingredients and you turn that into food that you can then use on while you're out and about, right? And so that I find fascinating, right? That a really great game to me is always one where all those things are wired together. And I find that even with films, right? Like I see the same thing. It's probably true of many art forms, that a really good film is one where no scene stands by itself and doesn't, and pushes the plot forward in some way, right? Like, oh, I learned more about that character. Oh, I learned more about that interconnection between these characters, or I learned about their history or something, right? And usually with a bad film where you feel like, this is kind of long, right? Is where they have a lot of scenes where it's just, okay, well, that happened and it didn't really connect to anything or the main plot or any of the characters or any of that stuff, right? And I find that just fascinating how, like the same is true for games, right? But just on a mechanical level. Like on a mechanical level, if you do these excursions, it still all has to connect. It still all has to kind of like fuse together. And that's why when I heard that Titan thing, right, I was like, I think the main problem was probably like, the main core gameplay loop was not there. And the way to approach it and to make something like that work is that you need to have that loop defined. And that has to be incredibly fun just by itself, right? And then you can expand and do other things. And that will then work if you do it well, if you connect all the dots. But if the dots don't connect, then you're screwed, right? Then it's just, okay, this is just a thing that stands by itself within that other thing that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, there's a topic related to this that I think I've mentioned in previous talks to do with overlapping axes of randomness, where I feel the more different ways in parallel you can have randomness related to the content you're adding, the more fun it is in the context of this type of game. It causes these situations where, the person's wanting the stars to align of 5 or 6 unlikely things to occur at the same time to have like a perfect result from that particular encounter or farming event or whatever it is.
My main inspiration regarding that actually came from Zelda. I don't know if you ever played any of the Zelda games. But so I grew up loving A Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo. And I think what that game did so incredibly well was that you could have totally designed the game where it would have just been dungeons, right? Like, hey, I walk into a dungeon and I, like defeat the enemies there and I get an item. And then as I exit the dungeon, well, my only next goal is go to the next dungeon and do that, right? But they did this thing where it's like, okay, no, we have a full overworld. And that overworld also has like all these elements in there, right? Where it's like, hey, you can only get here if you have the hook shot or if you have the Pegasus boots or something, right? And so the loop became, hey, I'm out and about, I find a dungeon, I go into the dungeon, I get an item, I defeat a boss, and I use that item that I found within the dungeon to defeat the boss, right? And then outside, you weren't forced to immediately go into the next dungeon. You actually had that nice moment of, I could go and play some mini game in some house somewhere, right? Or I could go and like farm the overworld now, because now that I got the hook shot, I could actually finally get in the overworld to this particular place that I never been able to get to before and get some rewards and so on, right? And I always found that incredibly addictive. And just there's something about the pacing of that is awesome, because if like I found on the Ori games, right, like when we kept the pacing at 11 for too long, it felt like, okay, this is just crazy. Like nothing is at 11 anymore if you're always playing at 11, right? Like a good game, the pacing should always be like a roller coaster, right? Where it's like, oh my God, there's this really intense combat stuff. And then it slows down and it's like, okay, now it's about exploration and this. And then suddenly it's about the combat thing again. And then, oh, now there's story moment or you solve some puzzles or something. And then it slowly amps up and then, oh, and now there's crazy combat and so on, right? And I think the Uncharted games and so on did the same thing. If you look at Uncharted, for example, it's very funny. Like if you look at it through a developer lens, right? Like you could totally like make a little chart where it's just, oh, here's the first thing that was about combat. Here's the next thing. Now it was about story. Here's the next thing. Now it's platforming. Here's the next thing. Now it's about combat again, right? And I think that's just a sign of a really good game, which is what I was talking about before, where it's like in a lot of times with ARPGs, I feel like that's too scrunched together, where a lot of times it's just, like if it would be Zelda, you would constantly just have that dungeon experience, right? Meaning it's just constantly, destroy, 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 kill, 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 right? And that to me is something where, I think we should learn from Zelda a little bit. Because there is something really nice about, like removing the pace a little bit, right? Like pulling it down. And you had that naturally with a lot of these like ARPGs, because that was the town experience, right? But within the town experience, I was always fascinated with, and what other things could we do within the town or within that overworld, right? Like I always loved the idea of like, imagine Diablo 1, but Tristram would have been broader and there would have been more to do, right? And like within Tristram, oh my God, there's also a cave I can enter here or something, right? And I can only do that after I've already been on level 6 or something of the sanctuary, right? That kind of thing. That to me is fascinating. That actually would be a really fun thing to do, right? That you would, if you would decompile Diablo 1 and then make a new version, right? That's those things, right? And you do the unholy thing of changing it, right? And seeing how players would react. That would be a very fun design exercise.
Yeah, that's true. I think that having stuff to do in town that isn't directly related to your mission of kill, get item, sell item, kill, get item, sell item is good, because it helps break up. It helps kind of tempt the players away from the currency per hour treadmill that is easy to slip into, and give them, other goals that they can think of at the same time. And I think that it makes the world feel quite a lot richer than just a reward treadmill.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. How do you feel about like, so there's this word diegetic, which refers to the concept of it, something being in world. Like, for example, if you're listening to, if you have some music in the game and the character can hear it because they're in like a bar and they can hear the music being played, that's diegetic music. Whereas if it's for the player, like it's fight scene music, that's non-diegetic. And this applies to quite a lot of stuff in games. Like if a UI pops open, that might be pretty non-diegetic. It's just a screen you click through. Whereas if you look at something like Minecraft, a lot of the things in there are diegetic. Like if you want to make a potion, you've got to get a brewing stand. And where do you get a brewing stand from? Well, you've got to find one or make one, and like having's going somewhere. And it's quite a lot of busy work. How do you feel about the presence of diegetic features in action RPGs? Because there's a lot of players out there who would argue that these are friction and they're working against the the currency per hour goal that they have.
Yeah, I couldn't agree less with that. And we went through similar things, right, with the ARPG audience, because they've been so trained that here's what an ARPG is and here's what it is not. And if you try to even like deviate from that path slightly, right, like a lot of players will immediately see that as a fault until they get it, right? Until they actually see, oh, actually, I'm having fun doing this, right? And I get it because it kind of like, changes the pace a little bit, right? And there will be players always who are like, no, fuck that. I want to just go kill, right? And that's also fine. But we had that, for example, when we introduced trees and resource veins, right? Like ore veins and so on, that kind of thing into Wicked, right? Where it's like, yeah, a lot of players, a lot of hardcore kind of like Diablo players were like, oh my God, I just want to go kill monsters, right? Why are you making me cut these stupid trees down and so on? But I do think like these kind of elements really help, first of all, making the world feel alive, right? And then also they help kind of like pulling down the pace again, right? Of like, oh my God, I was just attacked by 4 enemies at once and I defeated them, which by the way probably sounds ridiculous to you, right? But in the Rest for the Wicked, killing 4 enemies at once is like, it's a big deal. And I like those moments. I like those things. I like those little bits of interactivity where it's just, okay, now we're changing how like the pacing of the game works, or we're throwing you into a different experience, or oh my God, now there's an NPC that makes me want to do a race or something, right? Or any of those kind of things where I'm like, okay, try to do something a little bit different now, right? Because with Diablo especially, I consciously notice how I'm And everybody knows that who plays Diablo, right? Where you're almost just playing the minimap, right? Where you're not even like looking at the screen anymore, where you just, I need to follow this path and I'm clicking and I literally notice how my brain goes mush, right? Which is, I don't like that feeling. And that we try to fight in every way possible, right? Like even when we do quests, like we don't give you quest markers that just say, hey, go directly here. Because we put it like on a map that is like a top-down map for a 3D game, right? So it's like, well, even if we do that, you still have to kind of like find the direction. Or a lot of times with our quests, we just don't tell you exactly where the thing is. We just tell you, oh, it's at the in the shallow somewhere at the coast between the trees or something, right? And you have to find out where that is, right? Because there is a moment there where it's like, okay, now it's about exploration. Now it's asking me to remember where I've been before. And that to me is like, that just adds these new elements, right? Where you don't allow the player's brain to go mush, right? Because it's, oh, now I have to think. Now I actually have to be aware again and focus, right? I think that's incredibly important, actually. And, you know, with a lot of ARPGs, I feel like we are too focused on, well, always kind of like doing the same thing, right? Just all in the pursuit of numbers have to go up, stats have to go up. I need to kill, I need to get all these best items and so on, right? That you have a hard time really just breathing in the air that the game creates and like enjoying the world and that kind of thing.
Yeah, there are certainly some moment-to-moment things to do with navigation that can really ruin immersion with the world. You know, like I was playing Diablo 4 last year, and I think the environmental art in that game is amazing. I think there's some beautiful areas. They did such a good job. And I run through it on my horse at, 100 kilometers an hour and don't get a chance to see any of it because that's just how it's played. And I felt that was kind of sad. Like, there's an arrow telling me where to go, so I follow that 100% and never explore. And I know I want to explore, I should explore, but the gamer in me is saying you have to just, do this efficiently, and that means not seeing all of this cool content that you've paid to experience.
Imagine how the artist feels who put all of this stuff together, right? And you're like, now all the players just bash through it as fast as they can, not even seeing any of the beautiful pixels they designed and so on, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah, it is tricky especially because it's not even the designers on a team that are sitting there like trying to sabotage the work of the artists. It's the case of the pressures that there are in the industry, like the pressures there are in the ARPG ecosystem, are that players will ask for convenience features. And if you give too many convenience features at once, you accidentally undermine portions of your game that then cause the hard work of a lot of your creatives to not necessarily be noticed. And so it is very hard to find the right balance here. And I guess, like, I have a question for you. Okay. Would you rather be remembered as sticking to your vision or remembered for being really receptive to player feedback? If you had to pick one or the other, is it vision or feedback that you would rather have a reputation for?
If you make me pick one, I'd probably pick vision. But at the same time, I've been humbled a lot during the development of Nerfs to the Wicked, right? Because initially when we launched the game, it was pretty fucking hardcore. And a lot of the stuff that we did was pretty much like the typical developer mistake of like, hey, we played it for years. We think this particular tuning is fun. But then you give it to players and overwhelmingly they feel, hey, the fall damage should be tweaked or this kind of thing should be lowered, right? And ultimately, I think as a developer, you're the servant, right? Like you're not making a game for yourself. You're making it for the people out there, but you're still the tastemaker, meaning that if you just listen to the community, right, and you're just implementing whatever they want, and that's where, like, I always kind of like, I over the course of my career, I really started to trust my gut a lot, right? Meaning that if I really don't feel passionate about something, I probably won't do it, right? And I can still very much feel passionate about an idea or suggestions that players bring in that I might not originally have been on board with, right? But I could get on board with it if I just think about it a little bit differently, right? I would love to hear from you as well on this, right? That I think it has to be a little bit of both, but ultimately, I mean, we are the people that make the decisions. But I do think it helps a lot for a developer to recognize, like, you're not making the game for yourself. You want people out there to have the most amount of fun possible. And if that clashes with your particular vision, you have to change your vision.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I agree. That's obviously a mixture between the two. It's just really tricky to pick a side there. The Path of Exile players meme that I'm all about vision, and they're referring to a few cases where I didn't give in to popular feedback because I felt that it would undermine important parts of the game. The reality was that for a long time there were thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of feedback that did cause change in the game. But yes. I agree that the vision is important because it's the role of the developer. And these days, as execution for making games gets easier and easier, it really is a case of the taste and the vision is the thing that will set games apart from each other. Like if you have, we're reaching the point where if someone just has a relatively uninspired idea for a game, they can make that and they can release it and it will look good in trailers. And it's hard to tell the difference between that and a game that has, that's a better game potentially. And so I think that having a vision that you're consistent with, that players can trust, is quite important there.
Chris, let me actually ask you something. So you brought up the whole, your experience with Diablo 4, right? Where you just speeded through all the environments and so on with your horse and so on. And I think a lot of times on these kind of games, you can totally see that there's some idea that came in that wasn't that the game wasn't designed for, but it was pushed in anyway. I would argue that the horse was probably something like that, right? Where it's just, I think it's a terrible idea to add something like that into an ARPG in the same way. If you played Unreal Tournament back then, right? That was an arena shooter that was super tight. Every single footstep mattered and so on, right? And suddenly Halo came out and suddenly Unreal Tournament needs vehicles, right? And then they did that and it was awful. It was just the worst. It didn't make any sense. They tried to change the game and all of that stuff so that now vehicles made sense and so on. And it was just awful. But what I'm getting at is, let's talk about exploration for a second, right? Because when we were developing, one of the things that we wanted to change was combat. And I think we did that. And then the other thing that I always wanted to approach and that I wanted to challenge was that for a good 3 decades or so, right, there was this whole notion of, for an ARPG to be successful, you need to have the environments need to be randomized, right? And the problem that you have with randomized layouts is that because of the way that randomization works and because we're making top-down games, right, is that a procedural generator can't really make really good level designs. And I come from having level design for 10 years on the Ori games, where for Metroidvania, level design is one of the absolute most important aspects, right? Because it defines the moment to moment. It's the whole, I make the player jump here, then do a double jump to reach this other thing, then do a charge jump to get over here and so on, right? And that is one of the absolute key aspects. So for Wicked, we one of the decisions that we made was, because of Ori, we clearly said we're not going to do procedural level design. We are going to handcraft all these levels. But the twist is that what happens within the levels, that we're still going to randomize, right? So that if you walk through this environment that you've already known, right, that, hey, once you return to it, oh my God, there could be this crazy boss here, right? That, where did that come from, right? That kind of thing. So that you would still get that experience of oh my God, this is crazy, right? I'm returning to some area, because that is something that, by the way, always annoyed me about Dark Souls, that you come back to an excellently designed area like Undead Burg in Dark Souls 1, but it's just this lame thing of every single enemy is exactly where they were before, all the chests are already opened, and I don't have any reason to come back here other than to farm the enemies for some XP, right? But they're all in the same position and all the chests are gone, right? And all of that stuff. And I always found that pretty crappy, because the retraversal was just, there was just no reason to retraverse areas that you've already been to. But if you look at current ARPGs, procedural generation is still a major part of it. And the problem that I always have is it basically creates a flat plane, right? Like you can't do things where it's like, oh, like maybe with AI in the future, we'll have something where it's like, oh, actually, I want this place to be a castle. And I want these really intricate things where it's like, oh, I can climb this ladder. And then there's the scaffolding up there because the castle was never fully built. And then I have to jump from the scaffolding from this piece over to that and so on, right? You could never make these kind of experiences yet with procedural level design. I would love to know where you are now, because you guys, like when I listened to your GDC talk, right, there was a lot of it has to, like, we have to make maps as fast as possible, right? And they have to be different and all of that stuff, right? But the thing that strikes me as odd is that if you look at Diablo 4 and so on, that we still deal with a lot of this old stuff of like there's invisible walls everywhere. My character is bonking against this little ledge that he can't climb, even though it totally doesn't make sense. Like, obviously my character should be able to just step on this ledge, right? Or explore that thing behind there and so on. Where do you see things now? Like, now that you did Path of Exile and used procedural generation and so on, right? Like, what's your mindset on that now?
I think that I have a few views here. My first is that I think that if you're making a game that's going to be played a lot, the 10,000+ hour kind of game, the forever game, it really helps to have procedural generation, or at least significant variety. Like what you're saying by swapping out what appears in the areas, that's some form of procedural generation, maybe not to do with the topography of the area. But this stuff really helps the human brain not hit against deja vu moments when they're replaying the same content. If you make someone play through exactly the same layout a number of times, they're going to hit the board, I'm going to stop playing this moment way earlier. So there is a lot of value there. And the procedural generation tools that were made for Path of Exile, and especially Path of Exile 2, are so incredibly advanced at this stage. Like, GGG doesn't do enough to tell people how advanced those tools are. Like, it is, like, the examples you were giving of things you can't do with procedural generation, I was sitting there thinking, oh yeah, they can do that. And we'll be splitting hairs about the specifics. I'm sure there are cases of things that can't be done, but there's some really cool stuff there. And I'm really looking forward to seeing that leveraged fully. Obviously, it takes a lot of work to make it, to make it perfect, but there's some really cool stuff. And I feel personally, with my view on procedural generation these days, is that it is a really important pillar for action RPGs. I buy your arguments; they make sense, especially because your game is, different to games that I've made in the past. I understand that. My view these days is that I think that it's cool and everything if the layout of an area changes each time, because then you don't quite know what to expect. But it's more cool if the world feels that it's a little different in terms of the the presence of like secret areas and things that have happened and that kind of stuff. I'm not saying like full on Minecraft, it's a completely random space. I just mean the idea that your playthrough is unique because things have happened slightly differently is quite a cool, subtle thing that will keep people on edge. Because if you surprise people where there's an hour through playing something, there's something different that happens. 10 hours through playing, there's another different thing that happens. 100 hours, there's another different thing. It keeps them on edge because they don't know whether there's the 1,000-hour or the 10,000-hour thing. Like, for example, in Path of Exile, you encounter a secret NPC some high number of hours. It takes tens of thousands of hours to run into this dude. And that's just a thing that when you hear about it, or potentially even see him yourself, it causes you to think, what else is there that's hidden in the game that's going to be different each time? And so I like the idea of hiding surprises, and I'm pretty sure you wouldn't disagree with that either yourself.
No, absolutely. But the thing that I think can't really be done is, like, with a lot of these ARPGs, like your verbiage is a little bit limited, right? Like, meaning in a Diablo or even like Path of Exile 2, right? Like, you can't climb a ladder and jump and those kind of things, right? And that is really hard to do. Like, you can't design a cool castle where you're like, oh, this kind of like wall I can climb, and then I can balance across this scaffolding here, and then I can make a jump from this thing over to that rope, and then climb up that rope, right, and swing myself to get to this other thing. And I think maybe, AI might be in the future, like, might be able to kind of like be trained on a whole bunch of level designs, right, and then put something together. But I have trouble, and we don't have really procedural generation, and I would be quite curious, honestly, to see the procedural level generation tools that you guys had on Path of Exile 2. But that is really hard to do. Like we spent months and months and months. A typical level design in No Rest for the Wicked takes between 6 to 9 months to do, where every single inch is handcrafted, right? And then, part of that is also like basically designing the layouts multiple times, right? Like, hey, if you're within this courtyard of this area, here's the first state of things that can happen. Here's the other state. Here's the next state, right? And then even within that, you have variation of like, oh, this particular enemy spawner can spawn this huge enemy, right? Or there's a group constellation that can randomly pop in, and so on. I think that stuff is hard to do. That's where I would love to see more being done. That you just allow the player more movement opportunities, right? Like more to do, because that, I think, again, pulls you into this direction of like everything is just go kill, because that's literally like your character can just move and then attack, right? But you can't climb, you can't jump, you can't swim, you can't do a lot of these things that I think are really, really cool, that add just this moment of like, again, like pacing breaks, right? Of like, hey, oh my God, there's an island here in the distance. Like, I'm just going to swim over there. And then I find some stuff. And oh my God, there's a hole that I can drop into. Oh my God, there's an entire dungeon here now, right? That kind of thing. That is really hard to do with procedural generation.
I think that the reason why Path of Exile 2 and potentially Diablo 4 don't have some of those elements is that the walking on balance beam kind of verbs are ones that they've chosen not to put in the game for whatever reason. And like, it was cool when I was playing No Rest for the Wicked that there was a lot of cool interaction you could do with like shimmying across things, with the ship at the start, for example. That was neat stuff we haven't seen in action RPGs before. So you've got some territory there that other people aren't using. With regard to the distances of like, having a swing across a ravine or whatever, that stuff can be procedurally generated because the rooms are composed out of sections that designers have put together. And so depending on what granularity you're targeting, you can make these little bits and you can instruct it, to only have a swing if there's something on the other side worth swinging for, and so on. But
meaning that it doesn't have to be completely procedurally generated, but it can be made out of building blocks as well, where you put a certain building block in that then happens. Yeah.
At the end of the day, handcrafting will produce better results 100% for the single playthrough, right? Like this is going to be a huge topic with all the AI slop coming out in the future, right? Like handmade artisanal stuff that a human has sat there and purposefully put together is going to be king. And the trick with action RPG procedural generation, in my opinion, is to have as much handcrafted elements that are remixed in terms of the meta layout, just to prevent the human brain from feeling, I have played exactly this before. It came to mind while you were discussing climbing, swimming, running, jumping, and so on, that you should have a look at Darkhaven potentially. That's the Moonbeast game that Phil Schenk and Peter Hu and so on. That has both procedural generation and, because of the fully 3D world, a whole lot of climbing and swimming and stuff that you can do in 3D, which is pretty cool. I've only played about an hour or two of it myself, but there certainly were cases where I'd like build holes in the ground to put monsters in and jump over the hole myself and that kind of thing.
Yeah, seeing that was pretty crazy. Like, that is really interesting because they're doing kind of like voxel geometry or something, right? I would guess that you can deform. I haven't seen that in ARPGs yet. It'll be really interesting to see how they make that, like really work, right? Like, how does that actually feed into the core gameplay loop? How does that work with skills? How do we actually even do that, right? Like, and even like top down, right? Like we are fighting a lot with like, oh my God, you're being obstructed constantly by stuff, right? And we have to set up these manual fader groups and so on. And it's a pain in the nuts to do that. But that's what you have to do with these kind of like super vertical levels that we have.
Yeah, I know what you mean. There's always the question where if a game supports meaningful terrain deformation, does that let you subvert the game systems? Like, does the correct way to play involve cheesing the terrain stuff? And I don't know how that's going to play out. It wasn't a bad thing when I was playing the game. I wasn't cheesing stuff with the terrain too much, apart from sticking monsters in holes occasionally. But it fit the fantasy of the world, which was good.
So I'm really fascinated in, with all the hindsight that you have now, right? Meaning, hey, you worked for 10 years on, or over 10 years on Path of Exile, right? What would you have done differently? If you, like, just from a player experience perspective, and then also from a development perspective, right? If you'd have to do it all again, what are the learnings that you went through where you knew, hey, this thing we should have focused way more on, this thing we probably should have done less of, right? And this thing I'm really excited about, right? So looking at all of that, what's your hindsight verdict, like, on this is what you're excited about with ARPGs? These are the main pillars that I think we should change a bit.
Well, it was a long 17 years on the Path of Exile franchise, and I don't regret or would want to change any of the actual game stuff. Like, I think that the way that the game played out and the way that it is now is exactly how it should be. I think that, like, trying to rewrite the course of history by changing stuff just produces a completely different outcome, and I like the outcome that happened. People really like the game. They're having a lot of fun with it, and that's not something that I ever think, oh, I wish I'd done a decision differently. From a technical or development point of view, there's plenty of stuff where, you learn after you've had lots of experience at a studio how you can architect stuff differently. And Path of Exile's architecture is solid. Jonathan did an amazing job with the technical side of it, but there's certainly things we realized later into development that would have saved time earlier on. An example would be as you're aware, when you're releasing, sorry, as you're aware, when you're developing a game, you have a build process where when you make a change to the game, sometime later the build server spits out a copy of the game that you can play. And depending on how that's architected, and GGG have put a lot of effort into architecting it well, it can take some amount of time before the next build is available. And, in Path of Exile's case, this can be as fast as minutes. It can be a lot slower than minutes, depending on the scope of things that have changed. And this affects your iteration speed, as in how many times per day you can give a new version of the game to QA. Now, of course, there's plenty of local development, so you can make changes and a few seconds later make another change, unless you iterate really closely, by yourself. But if you're iterating with team members, you want the speed to be as high as possible. And GGG have put a lot of work into making their build process good. But certainly, having it be super fast right from the start would have meant way more iteration way earlier on, and that would have, potentially cut years off the development of the game initially. It was 7 years from, starting until we initially released. And I kind of believe that the quality of a game is proportional to how many times the developers get to play it. And so a faster iteration cycle and is tooling that's as good as possible around that really improves the quality of a game. And so I guess if I was to change anything, it would have been an even larger initial investment in tooling and process stuff on top of what GGG was already doing.
There's a really fascinating thing that's happening. Like, now that you brought this up, right? So I just went through that experience, as I said before, of like hacking into the Quake 1 source and like turning it into a roguelike, right? And the funny thing is, Quake 1, if you compile it now, it takes 2 seconds. So it's just incredible as a developer, right? That you have, I have an idea for some new boons or some new effects, right? And you code it up and you press compile and boom, it's playable, right? Like, just like that, it's all done and you can immediately try it, right? And it's such a wonderful process. Like, it's just incredibly satisfying. I can tell you right now, like, for No Rest for the Wicked, every time we make a build, it takes an hour and a half to just compile a build and try it, right? And if you look at it through, I mean, obviously we have the editor where we can just, make changes live and like see it right there. But it's still a different thing to play a full live build where you have all your characters that you already played before and all of that stuff, right? And as I was doing this, I was thinking, man, if I would work in a first-person shooter right now, I would it would totally be insane, right? And publishers would probably look at you strangely, right? If you would pitch them like, hey, here's my Quake 1 thing, and I'm testing out the entire game and I'm prototyping that inside this crude engine, right? But I would absolutely 100% go down that direction. I actually talked to Jonathan Blow about that at GDC. And he built Braid, which I found fascinating, in this really crude way, right? Where it's like, hey, for 80-90% of the production of the game, it was literally just placeholder art and everything, right? And he just had the most crude version, but it was complete. It was end-to-end, completely playable, everything, right? And only after that was done and the game was good, did he decide, okay, now we're going to make some high-res 2D art and all of that stuff, right? And I'm sure that's where all the, like, everything became slow and so on, right? But from that direction, I find that super fascinating because it was just such a, oh my God, like, you make a change and you don't even have to come up with some play mode that cuts some stuff and so on, right? but literally just, hey, you press compile and it compiles in 2 seconds is just a godsend. It's unbelievable. Like, you can make changes on the fly. You can test the entire game with those changes, right? So I think that's a really smart thing to say. Just even tooling wise and so on, I think a lot of developers out there, if you look at, I've always been frustrated, especially recently, with kind of like AAA for a long time has become this thing where it's like, well, the asset density and quality and so on has to become higher and higher, right? And what automatically happens is that, well, everything just takes a lot longer. Like, if you want to implement a feature, it just takes an incredible amount of time to A, produce those assets, and B, then finally try those assets, right? And I'm 100% in agreement with you that the game's quality is extremely dependent on how many times do you get to try it, right? Because if you are working on 5 different features for 5 new effects or something that you have in the game, or enchantments or affixes or whatever, right? Like, if you can literally just, hey, I came up with an idea, I coded up the idea, I press a button and I play it, right? That's incredibly powerful. Like, so even from the perspective of just Unreal or Unity or so on, right? Like that, like a lot of times with Unity, right? If you make a change, you have to reload the entire domain, which is just incredibly frustrating. Like, a lot of times in development, you just see loading bars, right? To the point where you can just, oh, I guess I have to reload domain, so I'm gonna go get some coffee, right? And it's horrible. So that is fascinating.
Yeah, it's kind of the hidden cost of AAA, right? Is that, you know, when someone asks, people ask me about game development quite a lot, and when someone says to me, like, should I get the $50 million to go and make some big AAA thing? It's not just that it costs a lot of money to do that, but it is that you will get to play your game less than you otherwise would, because the assets are bigger. They take longer to make. They take longer to load. They take longer to download, to patch, right? Like, you know, the process of running a copy of the game where, you know, things aren't optimized in development mode. And if you hit play and you have to wait 15 seconds for it to load versus waiting 0.15 seconds, there's a very big difference to how many times you can test stuff out in a given day. And so there is certainly a hidden cost.
Like, I have an 8-year-old boy now, right? And I've been recently playing a lot of games with him, and I think there's something fascinating happening where I recently played, like a year or two ago, so I played Secret of Mana with him on the Super Nintendo, right? And he literally still is talking about how beautiful that game was, right? Which is so odd that he's playing this pixel art game, and he played all these games after that, right? Like Zelda and so on, right? Where the asset cost is just 100 times higher, right? Like, if you make a bush in Secret of Mana and you pixel it up, it takes a few minutes. But if you make a bush in a Zelda game, right, it's like, oh my God, now I have to make the 3D models, now I have to texture that, now I have to do the physics on top of that, and so on. It's incredibly more involved, right? And so, funnily enough, I think there's a generation growing up, and it's probably also because of these games. It's different now, right? Like, people, like kids play Roblox and Fortnite and so on, that are arguably not that high quality in terms of like the assets themselves, right? And I think for them, it doesn't really matter anymore. Like, again, like, it's strange that if you had, like, back then, if somebody would have shown me Zelda Breath of the Wild or something, right, like 20 years ago, my mind would have been blown and I would have been like, oh my God, that is the perfect Zelda game just because of how it looks, right? But here, this new generation, right, I think there's something strange happening where that doesn't matter anymore, where it's just, you know, to them, like, if it's visually coherent, and if the art direction is good, it's good. It doesn't need to have, like, and I remember, like, dude, the amount of time we spent at Blizzard on assets, right? Just to model out every single pore of a character and so on. Or that fucking dragon that was done for the Cataclysm cinematic. That was just that fucking model was in development for like 9 to 12 months or something, right? And then you had to like model it, rig it, and so on. It's incredible effort, right? So so it's interesting to see what's happening right now with gaming, where I think there's an audience growing up that doesn't really care. As long as it looks good, it looks good. And it doesn't matter if it has 5,000 polygons or 500,000 polygons.
Yeah, I think there was something when you and I were growing up, we got to watch the evolution of gaming all the way through from, like, the first game that I saw, I think was, you know, the Oregon Trail on a black and green screened Apple II. in like 1986 or something. And you get to see the entire development of games where you see Wolfenstein, your mind is blown. You see Doom, your mind is blown. Then Quake, your mind is blown. And like, there's just this thing where you're expected to have your mind blown every 18 months. And that's going to be the new hot game. And all the other games are going to have that level of graphics all the way through to Crisis. And these days, given the kids are being born into a world where, there's post-Crisis, it's more about artistic quality as opposed to fidelity.
Which is fantastic, by the way. I love that change, right? I love that it's not about who, like, a good game is like who has the best asset quality, right? But it's really now about, which game is the most fun, right? Like, what actually is the most fascinating, who is innovating the most, and so on. I think we have a real opportunity here now as developers, right? To just say, hey, actually, let's not focus on making the next big tech thing, right? And I think that, that was true even until, say, Uncharted 4 or something, right? Like, a lot of the gaming press was always just focused on, what does Nathan Drake look like on the PlayStation, whatever, 4 now, right? Like, what could we make that look like? And I think we hit a point where it's just, who gives a fuck? Like, is the game good, right? Like, is it fun to play is what matters. And I think that's gold.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, thank you very much for coming on. It's been great to chat with you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. It was super fun to talk to you.
Oh, you too. Well, thanks very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, then please like it and consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.